You ever seen a man get detained for standing exactly where he was told to be? The question cut through the dry Texas air like a blade, sharp enough to make a few heads turn before anyone even realized who had spoken, but Captain Blake Turner didn't smile, didn't laugh, didn't even glance toward the source as he stepped forward with the rigid authority of a man who had never been told he was wrong, his boots striking the concrete tarmac in clean, echoing beats, each one louder than the last against the wide open space of Fort Ridgeline's forward checkpoint where heat shimmered just inches above the ground and the distant hum of rotor blades lingered like a low warning no one paid attention to, and in front of him stood an old man who didn't move, not when the captain approached, not when the two armed security personnel shifted uneasily to either side, not even when Turner stopped close enough that the shadow of his uniform cut across the man's worn boots. The kind of boots that had seen decades of use but were still polished just enough to suggest discipline rather than neglect, and for a moment the contrast was almost jarring, the crisp, pressed authority of modern command against something older, quieter, something that didn't need to prove itself, but Turner saw none of that. All he saw was a problem, an interruption, a figure that didn't belong in his perfectly controlled perimeter. "Sir, this is a restricted zone," he said, his tone flat but edged with impatience, the kind that came from being certain the situation was already beneath him. "I'm going to need you to step back behind the line," and still the old man didn't move, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the captain's shoulder, past the chain-link fencing, past the neatly aligned vehicles, toward the distant American flag snapping sharply in the wind as if that alone held more importance than anything being said to him, and that, more than anything, irritated Turner, because defiance he understood, confusion he could dismiss, but indifference, that quiet, immovable stillness, it felt like a challenge he hadn't been given permission to lose. "Did you hear me?" Turner pressed, louder now, drawing the attention of a few nearby personnel who slowed just enough to watch without appearing to watch, the old man finally shifting, not stepping back, not raising his hands, just turning his head slightly until pale blue eyes met the captain's, steady, unhurried, carrying a weight that didn't match the frail lines of his face, and when he spoke, his voice was low, roughened by time but unmistakably clear. "I'm not in the wrong place," he said, and the words didn't sound like an argument, they sounded like a fact that had already been settled somewhere far beyond this moment. Turner let out a short breath, almost a laugh but not quite, shaking his head as if dealing with something tedious rather than important. "Everyone says that," he replied, gesturing briefly toward the marked boundary line just a few feet away. "You're not cleared for this area, and I don't have time to debate it." He stepped closer, close enough now that the faint scent of worn leather and sun-baked fabric drifted off the man's jacket, an old field coat faded to a dull green that hadn't been issued in decades, and Turner's eyes flicked down for just a second, catching the edge of a small, battered leather satchel hanging at the man's side, its surface creased and scarred like it had been carried through places no longer listed on any official map. "Let me make this simple," Turner continued, his voice tightening. "Either you step back now, or I have security escort you out," and somewhere behind him, a radio crackled softly, the distant chop of helicopter blades grew just a fraction louder, but the old man didn't look at any of it, didn't acknowledge the threat, didn't shift his stance, he just held the captain's gaze for one quiet second longer before speaking again, just one sentence, calm and certain, "General Kane knows I'm here," and for a split second, something in the air changed, not enough for most people to notice, but enough that one of the nearby sergeants paused mid-step, his brow tightening as if a thought had just brushed the edge of recognition, while Captain Turner simply scoffed, the sound sharp and dismissive. As he shook his head again, "Right," he said, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth, "and I suppose he invited you personally," and the old man didn't answer, didn't need to, because somewhere in the distance, just beyond the steady rhythm of the base, a helicopter began to descend, and no one at the checkpoint had been told to expect it. The sound of the approaching helicopter grew from a distant hum into a steady, unmistakable rhythm that pressed against the air like a rising storm, and even the most disciplined personnel at the checkpoint could not ignore it anymore as heads began to turn in quiet synchronization, eyes lifting toward the sky where the dark silhouette of a UH-60 began to emerge over the far hangars, its rotor wash already stirring dust along the edges of the tarmac, but Captain Blake Turner did not look up. Not yet, because his focus was locked on the man in front of him, on the quiet defiance that refused to bend to rank or command, and that alone was enough to push his patience to its limit. "You think dropping a general's name changes anything here?" Turner said, his voice sharper now, louder, carrying just enough to draw a few more onlookers into the widening circle of attention. "I do not care who you claim to know, you do not have clearance, and you are not stepping another inch forward." He motioned to the security personnel beside him with a short, decisive gesture, the kind that expected immediate compliance, and they hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, not because they doubted the order, but because something about the old man's stillness made the moment feel heavier than it should have been, like stepping into water deeper than it looked, and that hesitation did not go unnoticed, Turner's jaw tightening as he glanced between them. "Move him," he added, quieter but colder, and still the old man did not resist, did not raise his voice, did not even shift his footing. He simply adjusted his grip on the worn leather satchel at his side as one of the guards stepped closer, uncertainty flickering in his eyes before he reached out, and that was when it happened, not an action, not a struggle, just a small, almost accidental motion as the strap of the satchel slipped slightly and the flap loosened, revealing a glimpse of what lay inside, something metallic, dull with age, catching just enough light to draw attention, and Sergeant Noah Briggs, who had been standing 10 feet back trying very hard not to get involved, felt his breath catch in a way he could not explain, his eyes narrowing as he leaned just slightly to get a better look. The shape was familiar, not because it was polished or official, but because it was not, because it looked like something made in a place where official things did not exist, something improvised, something carried through time rather than issued by it, and Briggs felt a quiet, uneasy recognition settle in the back of his mind, the kind that did not come from training manuals or briefings but from stories passed down in low voices between people who had seen more than they ever put into reports. "Sir," Briggs said carefully, stepping forward just enough to be heard without challenging the captain directly, "maybe we should verify before we escalate." Turner turned his head slowly, his expression flattening into something colder than irritation. "There is nothing to verify, Sergeant," he replied, each word precise, controlled. "This is a secured area, and he does not belong here." Behind them, the helicopter descended lower, the wind now strong enough to tug at uniforms and ripple through the flag in sharp, snapping waves, the sound filling the space so completely it became impossible to ignore, and finally Turner glanced up, just for a second, just enough to register that this was not a routine flyover, not a scheduled transport, this was a direct approach, controlled, intentional, and when his eyes dropped back down to the old man, something in his posture shifted. Not uncertainty, not yet, but a subtle tightening, a recalculation. "He would never admit to, last chance," Turner said, his voice lower now, almost lost beneath the roar of the rotors. "Step back, or you will be removed," and the old man, Daniel Mercer, simply looked past him once more, not at the helicopter, not at the growing crowd, but somewhere beyond all of it, as if he had already seen how this moment would end, and when he spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper, just steady, unshaken. "You might want to let that aircraft land first," and the words were not a warning, not a threat, just a quiet statement that made Sergeant Briggs feel a chill run down his spine as the helicopter touched down less than 100 yards away without a single prior call over the base frequency. The rotor wash rolled across the checkpoint in a powerful surge, flattening loose gravel and snapping the edges of uniforms. As the helicopter settled onto the tarmac with precise control, its presence commanding attention in a way no shouted order ever could, and for a brief moment the entire base seemed to pause, conversations cut short, footsteps slowing, every eye drawn toward the unexpected arrival that had not been cleared through any visible channel, and Captain Blake Turner felt it before he fully understood it, that subtle shift in control, the kind that happens when something larger than your authority enters the scene without asking permission. But he held his ground, shoulders squared, jaw set, refusing to let the moment define him before he defined it. "Stay focused," he snapped to the nearby guards, his voice sharper than before, compensating for the growing noise. "This does not change anything," yet even as he said it, his eyes flicked again toward the aircraft, watching as the side door opened with a smooth mechanical slide and a figure appeared in the shadowed interior, tall, composed, moving with the deliberate calm of someone who never needed to rush, and Sergeant Noah Briggs felt his stomach tighten as recognition came not from the face, not yet, but from the posture, from the way the figure paused at the threshold for half a second as if measuring the entire scene in a single glance before stepping down onto the tarmac. boots hitting the ground with quiet authority that somehow carried farther than the helicopter itself, and the wind shifted just enough for the name to ripple through the nearby personnel like a low current, not spoken loudly, not announced, just recognized, and that was when Turner finally turned fully toward the landing zone, his expression tightening as the realization began to form, slow and unwelcome, the kind that did not arrive all at once but built piece by piece, detail by detail, until it could no longer be ignored. Because the man walking toward them was not just any officer, not just a visitor, it was General Victor Kane, the base commander himself, moving with a pace that was neither hurried nor relaxed, each step measured, direct, cutting a straight line from the helicopter to the checkpoint as if everything else on the base had ceased to exist the moment he arrived, and the effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable. Conversation stopped completely now, backs straightened, a few personnel instinctively shifting into attention without being told, the air tightening with a different kind of discipline, one that did not come from orders but from presence alone, and Turner felt it like pressure against his chest, the realization now fully formed but not yet accepted, because accepting it meant admitting that something in the last few minutes had gone very, very wrong, and still he held his position, because stepping back now would be an acknowledgment he was not ready to make. General, on approach, one of the guards muttered under his breath, barely audible over the fading rotor noise, and Briggs swallowed hard, his eyes flicking once toward Daniel Mercer, expecting some reaction, some shift, but there was none. The old man stood exactly as he had before, calm, unmoved, as if this entire sequence had been expected, as if the arrival of a commanding general by helicopter was not an interruption but a continuation of something already in motion. And that was what unsettled Briggs the most, not the authority, not the sudden escalation, but the quiet certainty in Mercer's stillness, the sense that the outcome of this moment had never been in doubt for him, and as General Kane drew closer, the distance closing step by step, the tension at the checkpoint thickened into something almost tangible, a silence that pressed in from all sides, waiting, watching, as Captain Turner straightened his uniform, preparing to speak, to report, to regain control of a situation that was slipping further out of his hands with every passing second. But before he could say a single word, General Kane's eyes lifted and locked onto the old man standing just beyond him, and in that instant, something in the general's expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of recognition that did not belong to the present, but to something much older, something that reached back far beyond the boundaries of this base and into a past that had never truly been left behind. General Victor Kane stopped 3 paces short of the checkpoint line, and for a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should have, he said nothing, did nothing, his eyes fixed entirely on Daniel Mercer as if the rest of the world had been reduced to background noise, the hum of the cooling rotor blades, the distant clatter of equipment, even the rigid posture of Captain Blake Turner standing directly in front of him, all of it faded beneath the weight of that single, unbroken gaze, and Turner, trained to read command presence, felt something he could not immediately define, not anger, not confusion, but recognition, the kind that does not ask questions because it already knows the answer. "Sir," Turner began, his voice tight but controlled as he snapped into formal posture, ready to deliver a concise report that would re-establish order. This individual breached the restricted perimeter and refused to comply with. But the words did not land, they did not even fully form before General Kane raised a single hand, not sharply, not aggressively, just enough to stop the sentence in place as cleanly as if it had never been spoken, and the silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand, because it was intentional, deliberate, and absolute. Kane did not look at Turner when he interrupted him, did not acknowledge him at all, his attention remained on Mercer, unwavering, and as the seconds passed, something shifted in his expression again, not outwardly dramatic, but enough that Sergeant Noah Briggs felt it like a pressure change in the air, the kind that precedes a storm you cannot see yet, and then Kane took one slow step forward, crossing the invisible line of authority that Turner had been guarding so fiercely just moments ago, and the movement alone was enough to draw a quiet ripple through the gathered personnel, because it was not just a step, it was a decision, a declaration that whatever rules had been enforced here seconds earlier no longer applied in the same way, and when Kane finally spoke, his voice was lower than expected, steady, controlled, carrying none of the sharp command tone Turner had anticipated. "Where did you find him?" he asked, but the question was not directed at Mercer, it was directed at the situation itself. As if he was already piecing together events that no one had fully explained yet, Turner hesitated, just briefly, caught off guard by the phrasing, by the absence of accusation, by the subtle implication that something had been mishandled. Sir, he was at the outer checkpoint, no identification, no clearance, claimed he was expected. Again, the sentence ended before it could complete, because Kane's gaze shifted for the first time, not fully away from Mercer, but enough to settle on Turner with a focus that was precise and measured, and in that moment Turner understood something without it being said, that this was no longer a routine report, this was not a situation to be managed, it was a moment to be corrected, and before he could adjust, before he could recalibrate his tone or his stance, Kane spoke again, quieter this time, but with a weight that carried further than volume ever could. Captain, he said, and the single word was enough to straighten every spine within earshot, do you know who you are addressing? And there was no anger in the question, no raised voice, no visible reprimand, but the effect was immediate. Turner felt it like a sudden drop beneath his feet, the realization that the foundation he had been standing on for the past several minutes was no longer solid, that the assumptions he had made were not just incorrect, but dangerously so, and for the first time since the encounter began. He did not have an immediate answer, his mouth opening slightly before closing again. The silence stretching just long enough to confirm what he had not yet admitted, that he did not know, and behind him, Briggs lowered his gaze, the pieces finally aligning in a way that made his chest tighten, because he did know, or at least he suspected enough to understand that this moment was no longer about protocol, it was about something far older, something earned long before any of them had stepped onto this base. And as Kane turned back fully toward Mercer, the tension reached a quiet peak, every eye fixed on what would happen next, because whatever came after this would not just resolve the situation, it would redefine it entirely. General Victor Kane closed the final step between them with a calm that felt heavier than any command he could have given, and for a brief moment neither man spoke, the air between them thick with something unspoken, something that did not belong to this base or this moment but had traveled across years to arrive here intact, unchanged, and as Kane's eyes moved over Daniel Mercer's face, taking in the lines carved by time, the quiet steadiness that had not faded, the worn jacket, the satchel that hung at his side like it had never once been set down, there was no doubt left in his expression now, no hesitation, only recognition, deep and absolute, the kind that settles into a person's posture without needing to be announced, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of rank, stripped of distance, carrying something far more personal than protocol allowed. You took your time, he said, and the words were simple, almost casual, but they did not belong to a general addressing a civilian, they belonged to something else entirely, something older. And Mercer's response was just as quiet, just as measured. Traffic was light, he replied, and for a fraction of a second, the corner of Kane's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close enough that those watching felt the ground beneath the situation shift in a way they could not yet explain. Behind them, Captain Blake Turner stood rigid, every instinct telling him to speak, to correct, to regain control, but something held him in place, something in the tone, in the exchange, in the complete absence of formality that should have been there, and Sergeant Noah Briggs felt it too, that realization settling deeper now, the understanding that whatever this was, it did not follow the chain of command they had been trained to rely on. And then Kane's gaze dropped, just briefly, to the satchel at Mercer's side, to the edge of the metal fragment still barely visible beneath the worn leather flap, and that single glance was enough to change everything. Because when his eyes lifted again, there was no trace of distance left in them. Only certainty, and without another word, without looking at anyone else, General Victor Kane straightened, his posture shifting in a way that was immediate and unmistakable, and in one smooth, deliberate motion, he raised his hand in a formal salute, precise, controlled, held not for a superior officer, not for ceremony, but for the man standing quietly in front of him, and the effect was instantaneous. A shockwave of silence that moved through the checkpoint as every person within sight froze in place, because this was not something they had ever been trained to see, not something that fit into any manual or protocol, a base commander saluting a man with no visible rank, no insignia that matched current standards, no authority that could be measured in the present, and yet the weight of that salute left no room for doubt, it carried a recognition that outranked everything else on that field, and Mercer did not rush to return it, did not react with surprise. He simply met Kane's gaze for a moment longer before slowly, deliberately raising his own hand, the motion steady despite the years behind it, returning the salute with the same quiet precision, and in that exchange, something invisible but undeniable settled over the entire scene, something that made every previous word spoken at that checkpoint feel smaller, thinner, irrelevant, and only after the salute was complete did Kane lower his hand and finally turn, just slightly, enough to acknowledge Captain Turner without fully shifting his focus away from Mercer. "Captain," he said, his tone calm, but carrying a weight that pressed down harder than any raised voice could have, "you were saying something earlier," and Turner felt every eye on him now, felt the full weight of the moment settle onto his shoulders as the realization became complete, not partial, not uncertain, but absolute, that the man he had just tried to remove from the base was someone his commanding officer had just saluted without hesitation, and for the first time since the encounter began, Captain Blake Turner had no words at all. The silence that followed felt heavier than any command that had come before it, stretching across the checkpoint as Captain Blake Turner stood frozen between instinct and realization, his training pushing him to respond while his understanding struggled to catch up, and for a brief moment it showed, not in his posture, which remained rigid, but in the hesitation behind his eyes, the fraction of a second where certainty gave way to doubt. And that was enough for everyone watching to feel it. Because authority, once shaken, does not collapse loudly, it shifts quietly, just enough for those paying attention to notice. "Sir," Turner finally said, his voice measured but lacking the sharp edge it carried before, "I was enforcing perimeter protocol." The words sounded correct, structured, exactly what they should have been, but they did not carry the same weight now, not after what everyone had just witnessed. And General Victor Kane did not respond immediately. He let the statement settle, let the moment breathe, his gaze still partially on Daniel Mercer as if confirming something that no one else could see, before turning fully toward Turner, and when he did, there was no anger there, no visible reprimand. Only a calm precision that made the absence of emotion feel far more deliberate. "Protocol exists to protect people," Kane said, his tone steady, not to ignore them, and the words were not loud, not forceful, but they landed with a clarity that cut through the tension more effectively than any raised voice could have. Turner straightened further, if that was even possible, his mind moving quickly now, recalculating, trying to reframe the situation into something he could control. "Sir," he had no identification, no prior clearance on record, he continued, and this time there was a hint of defensiveness beneath the professionalism, subtle, but present, and Kane nodded once, a small acknowledgment that did not dismiss the point but did not validate it either. "That is correct," he said, and then, without breaking eye contact, he added, "because he does not need one," and that sentence, simple as it was, shifted the ground beneath Turner completely, because it removed the final piece of logic he had been holding on to, the last structure that justified his actions, and behind him, Sergeant Noah Briggs felt the full weight of that statement settle in, the confirmation of what he had already begun to understand, that Daniel Mercer was not outside the system, he was beyond it, and Kane turned slightly, just enough to include the surrounding personnel in his words without raising his voice. "There are individuals whose service predates your records, your systems, even your protocols," he said, his gaze sweeping briefly across the small group, "and when they arrive, you do not question their presence. You recognize it," and the silence that followed was different now, not tense, not uncertain, but heavy with realization, because this was not just a correction, it was a lesson, one that extended beyond the captain standing in front of him, and Turner felt it fully now. The shift from authority to accountability, the understanding that the moment was no longer about control but about acknowledgment, and for the first time since the encounter began, his posture changed, not dramatically, not in a way that broke discipline, but enough that those closest to him could see it, the slight lowering of tension in his shoulders, the recalibration of stance that signaled acceptance rather than resistance. "Understood, sir," he said, and this time the words carried something different, not just compliance, but recognition of something he had not seen before, and Kane held his gaze for a second longer before giving a small nod, not as approval, but as closure, and then, without another word about the incident, he turned back to Mercer, the entire weight of the situation settling into something quieter, more personal again, as if the correction had been made and the rest no longer required explanation, and in that moment, The base did not feel like a place of strict lines and controlled access anymore, it felt like something older had just passed through it, something that did not need permission to be there, only the awareness to be recognized. The air settled into a quieter rhythm as the helicopter blades slowed behind them, their steady rotation fading into a low mechanical whisper that no longer dominated the space, and with it the tension that had gripped the checkpoint began to shift, not disappearing, but transforming into something more deliberate, more focused, as General Victor Kane stood beside Daniel Mercer rather than in front of him. A subtle change in position that spoke louder than any order, because it placed them not as opposing forces but as aligned presences, and for those watching, that distinction mattered, even if they could not fully explain why. "Walk with me," Kane said, his voice calm, directed at Mercer without formality, and Mercer gave a small nod, the kind that carried no hesitation, no need for clarification, as if this had always been the next step, and together they began to move, not toward the command building, not toward any obvious destination, but along the edge of the tarmac where the open space stretched wide under the afternoon sun, and as they passed, personnel instinctively stepped aside, creating a path without being told, a quiet corridor formed not by rank alone, but by recognition, and Captain Blake Turner remained where he stood, watching, the weight of the moment still settling into him, his mind replaying the last several minutes with a clarity that was sharper now than it had been in real time, each word, each decision, each assumption lining up in a way that made their consequences impossible to ignore, while Sergeant Noah Briggs lingered just behind, his gaze following Mercer's satchel, that worn leather bag that seemed to carry more history than anything officially documented on the base, and as Kane and Mercer walked. Their conversation remained low, not hidden, but not intended for the wider audience. "You still carry it," Kane said after a few steps, his eyes flicking briefly toward the satchel, and Mercer gave a slight shrug, the motion small but meaningful. "Never found a reason to set it down," he replied, and there was something in that exchange that felt heavier than the words themselves, something that suggested continuity rather than nostalgia. As if the past they shared had never fully ended, only changed shape, and Kane nodded once, his gaze drifting forward as they continued, the sunlight catching the edges of his uniform while Mercer's silhouette remained softer, less defined by rank and more by presence. "They do not teach it the same way anymore," Kane said, almost to himself, and Mercer's response came without pause. "They teach what they can measure," he said, and Kane let out a quiet breath that might have been agreement, might have been reflection, and behind them, the checkpoint remained still, the personnel there no longer uncertain, but attentive in a different way, as if they had just witnessed something that did not require immediate action but demanded understanding over time, and Turner finally moved, just one step, then another, not to follow, not to interrupt, but to reposition himself within the space he had nearly misread, his posture no longer rigid with control, but steady with awareness, and Briggs glanced at him briefly, seeing the shift. Recognizing it for what it was, not defeat, but correction, and as Kane and Mercer reached the far edge of the tarmac, they slowed slightly, the open horizon stretching out in front of them, and for a moment they stood side by side without speaking, the wind moving gently now, carrying none of the urgency from before, only a quiet reminder that time had passed, that years had layered themselves between moments like this, and yet somehow, when they mattered, those layers could fall away, leaving only what had been earned, what had endured, and what could still be recognized without needing to be explained. The wind carried a quieter tone now, softer, steady, brushing across the open stretch of tarmac as General Victor Kane and Daniel Mercer stood side by side facing the horizon, the vast Texas sky stretching out in pale blue layers above them, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because whatever needed to be said did not belong to words alone, it belonged to memory, to time, to the kind of understanding that only forms between people who have already seen each other at their worst and still recognize what remains, and Kane finally broke the silence, not turning his head, his eyes still fixed ahead. "They rebuilt most of it," he said, his voice low, reflective. "New systems, new protocols, everything cleaner, faster." Mercer gave a slight nod, his gaze following the same distant line. "They always do," he replied, and there was no judgment in it, only observation, the kind that came from watching cycles repeat without needing to interfere with them. Kane exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost to the wind. "They think it is about control," he added, and Mercer's response came just as steady. "It is about memory," he said. And that single sentence seemed to settle into the space between them with a quiet finality. Because it explained something neither of them had needed to argue, only to acknowledge, and behind them, the base continued to function, vehicles moving in the distance, personnel returning to their duties, but the energy had changed, subtly, like a shift in pressure that made everything feel slightly more grounded, more aware, and back at the checkpoint. Captain Blake Turner remained still for a moment longer before finally moving with purpose, not rushed, not uncertain, but deliberate, as he walked toward Sergeant Noah Briggs, who had not taken his eyes off Mercer since the moment the satchel had slipped open. "What did you see?" Turner asked quietly, not as a challenge, not as a command, but as a question he genuinely needed answered, and Briggs hesitated for only a second before responding. "Not something official," he said, choosing his words carefully, "but something real," and Turner nodded once, absorbing that, understanding more in that simple distinction than he would have minutes ago, and when he looked back toward Mercer and Kane, he did not see a breach of protocol anymore. He saw a gap in his own awareness, one that had just been corrected in the only way it could have been, through experience rather than instruction. And out on the tarmac, Kane shifted slightly, turning just enough to face Mercer. "There is a briefing scheduled in 20 minutes, he said, the formal structure returning to his tone, "but not the distance. They would benefit from hearing you." Mercer let out a quiet breath, almost a chuckle, the sound soft but unmistakably human. "I am not here to speak," he said, and Kane's expression did not change, but his eyes reflected understanding. "You never were," he replied, and for a moment they both stood there again, the conversation complete without needing expansion, and then Mercer adjusted the strap of his satchel, the worn leather settling back into place against his side as if it had never shifted at all, and when he turned to walk, it was not toward the command building, not toward the center of the base, but along the outer edge, following a path that did not require clearance or direction, only familiarity, and Kane watched him go without stopping him, without calling him back, because some people did not need to be guided once they had already found their way. And as Mercer moved further into the distance, his figure growing smaller against the wide open space, there was no announcement, no formal acknowledgment, only the quiet understanding that something significant had just passed through the base and left without leaving a trace anyone could document, except in the way people stood a little straighter, thought a little deeper, and understood that not everything important could be measured, recorded, or cleared through a system. Some things simply had to be recognized when they appeared, and remembered long after they were gone. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the base as the last echoes of rotor noise faded completely into the distance, leaving behind a stillness that felt earned rather than empty, and for those who had witnessed what had just unfolded, that stillness carried weight, not pressure, but presence, the kind that lingers long after the moment itself has passed. And Captain Blake Turner stood at the edge of the checkpoint, his posture no longer rigid with enforcement, but steady with reflection, his eyes following the path where Daniel Mercer had disappeared, a path that had not been marked on any map, yet somehow felt more defined than any road on the base. And beside him, Sergeant Noah Briggs adjusted his stance, the tension in his shoulders gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to understanding. "You will not find his name in the system," Briggs said after a moment, not looking at Turner, but speaking as if the thought had already been forming long before it reached words, and Turner nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "I know," he replied, and there was no frustration in it now, no resistance, only acceptance, because what he had encountered was not a gap in data, it was a gap in perspective, one that could not be filled by reports or credentials, only by experience. And behind them, the base had returned to motion, vehicles moving, personnel resuming their duties, the rhythm of structure re-establishing itself, but it was not the same rhythm as before. Something had shifted beneath it, subtle but undeniable, like a foundation that had been quietly reinforced. And across the tarmac, General Victor Kane remained where Mercer had left him, standing alone for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze following the same direction, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. And when he finally turned back toward the command building, his expression had settled into something composed, but not unchanged, because some moments do not alter what you know, they remind you of what you almost forgot. And as he walked, a few officers straightened instinctively, offering salutes that he returned without pause, the structure of command reasserting itself around him, yet carrying a quieter edge, a deeper awareness that authority is not always defined by visibility. And back at the checkpoint, Turner exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, as if releasing something he had been holding without realizing it. He said the general knew he was here, Turner murmured, almost to himself, and Briggs gave a faint nod. He did not say it to convince you, Briggs replied, he said it because it was already true, and that distinction settled between them with a clarity that did not need further explanation, because it captured everything that had just taken place, the difference between proving something and simply being it. And Turner finally turned away from the horizon, his posture aligning once more with the discipline he had always carried, but now tempered with something else, something quieter, something earned. And as the last traces of Mercer's presence disappeared into the distance, there was no announcement, no record, no official acknowledgment added to the day's log, only a shift in the way people stood. The way they listened, the way they understood that not every rank is worn, not every order is spoken, and not every legacy needs to be explained to be recognized, and somewhere beyond the boundaries of the base, beyond the lines that defined access and authority, Daniel Mercer continued on without looking back, because he did not need to. The moment had already done what it was meant to do, leaving behind a lesson that would not be written down, but would be remembered, quiet, steady, and lasting, like respect that does not ask to be given, only to be understood.